because we don't know what the next big forest outbreaking insect is going to be, what we need is really a focus on making our landscape like resilient.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
So if you have a resilient landscape, then that is one that can undergo disturbance and then recover ecosystem process functioning.
Yes.
That's what we want.
Love that.
I honestly don't exactly, in my personal opinion, I don't care what the forest looks like. I want the forest to function and support all the insects and wildlife species and birds and plants that should be there.
Hey, what's happening, folks? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Kristoff, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Now, today's episode is all about insects. It's all about entomology. It's all about forest pests. And to do that, to have that conversation, I brought on Caroline Whitehouse. She is a forest health specialist with the Government of Alberta, which means she is keeping tabs on all those pesky forest bugs out there that are causing the forest industry problems, and making sure that the forest is healthy long-term as a result of these pests and their rampant nature as a result of climate change and all the other kind of things that cause weirdness in the forest. And she's also finishing her Ph.D., and she gave this incredible talk at the Alberta School of Forest Science and Management, their seminar series. The talk was called Debugging the Bugs, the Importance of Forest Insects in Forest Management. The link to that's going to be in the show notes. It was such a great talk because she didn't just sit there and talk about the problems we're having with insects. She spent almost the entire time talking about how awesome insects are, how important they are to the ecology of forests, why they're there, what is their role, what do they do, why do we need to think about them, why do we need to worry about them, why do we maybe need to conserve them. Now that was a take on insects that I hadn't really heard, and I loved it. I had to have her on. We managed to make it work, and this is the resulting conversation that we had. You're going to love it. It was everything I wanted it to be. Sponsors for this episode, West Fraser is the number one sponsor. They've been with me almost since the very beginning. I could not do this without them. They make it possible. They allow me to do whatever I want to do with it, and I couldn't thank them enough. Thank you, West Fraser, for your support over the years. It's been incredible. And also, Greenlink Forestry has been with me since the beginning. I could not do this without them. Thank you, Greenlink. Now, I need one more thing from you. If this is not your first time here, if you've listened to this show before and you liked it and you haven't rated or reviewed this show yet, please do so. It makes all the difference in the world. It really is what drives things forward and allows this to be spread to more people. So I really appreciate it. Taking those 2 seconds to just hit the rating, give a little review means everything. Thank you very much for your support. I really, really appreciate it. Now, without any further messing around, let's dive into this conversation all about forest insects and the appreciation of with Caroline Whitehouse. Here we go. First of all, I think I want to start with just getting to know you a little bit. And the question I came up with was, why insects? So basically, I want to know your insect origin story.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay. Start with that.
Yep, sounds good. Well, so my insect origin story, I didn't really start out being very interested in insects. I wasn't interested in insects as a child. I wasn't one of those kids that, had a little, insect collecting net or anything like that.
Okay.
I was more interested in like squirrels and plants. I ran around collecting rose hips to dry, like that kind of
nice. Okay.
childhood.
Yeah.
And then, so anyways, I went to university a little bit later in life. I had decided I wanted to go into ecology, and really my intention was to understand the forest ecosystems.
Okay.
Because, I spend a lot of time out in the bush, and I was like, I don't even know how any of this works.
Yeah.
Still, insects were not on my radar in any other way than, mosquitoes being annoying. So I think it was in my third year of university, I had to take an entomology course. And up to that point, I had decided, I'm really fascinated in like big animal population dynamics for some reason.
Yeah.
That was really interesting to me. But then I took this entomology 220 course with Dr. Felix Sperling. And like my mind was completely blown because that was like the first time I was exposed to the diversity of insects.
Okay.
Like amazing number of species, amazing life histories, rapid evolution. They're in like all these ecological niches. And so then all of a sudden I had names for these tiny little things that had not been seen to me before. Yeah. And it really opened up this like brand new world. And so I just became really fascinated with insects after that.
Nice.
And then I took all the entomology courses that I could for the rest of my university degree. And then that's eventually what I ended up studying for graduate work and going forward.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, but always obviously clearly engaged in nature and what's going on. And then just kind of the focus shifted a little bit for you.
Yeah, absolutely. When you think that you're like, it was like opening a veil.
Sure. Yeah.
Because it's this completely unknown world for a lot of different people. And so I think it also like deepened my connection with nature because it's just like, you understand and can name these things that are small, and it really connects you to even the biggest thing like a tree.
And no one else knows them, so you can.
I do get a lot of questions about, what is this little brown beetle? And I'm like, I don't know. It's a little brown beetle. I can tell you it's a beetle.
Everyone else is calling the woodlice roly-polies, and you've got the Latin name.
That's right.
Yeah, that's funny. So I think I can relate to that because I remember just a little while ago I recorded an episode about the kind of life beneath the soil kind of thing, right? So like it was mycorrhizal stuff, but it was also talking about the invertebrates and that kind of thing. Yeah. And it just opened up this whole concept of thinking about the entire other ecosystem that lives below ground, right? And that kind of just like opens, you're like, whoa, like I get the opening the veil thing I can totally get, right? I'm like, I obviously I don't know those things, but listening to them talk about it, like the diversity and the abundance and the like just how much is going on that we're not aware of is like, so I can relate to that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. When you start to think about what underground processes, like that's even more mind-blowing because that's so hard to study. But there's, like you say, there's so much going on down there. And I don't even think we understand like the relative, like how important underground processes are relative to like above ground. Yeah. I don't even think we know that.
No, I don't think we do either. Yeah, no, totally. I can't even imagine what's going on. I think there was one thing they said in 1 cubic centimeter of soil, there was like 1,000 kilometers of mycelium or something. I don't know. I that's probably the wrong stat, but it was cool anyways.
It's immense.
So anyways, going up a little bit bigger into insects and stuff like that, it's definitely, I think it's the next step. I think I've been looking for somebody to talk about insects in forests for a long time, and I don't know how I don't know why I've never found the right person. I reached out to a few people that ignore me, and that's fine. I get it. It happens. But so I'm excited to talk to you about this and kind of get the deep dive. And I especially liked, I think what brought my attention to you was obviously the talk you gave, debugging the bugs. That's what it's called, right?
Yep.
And I liked it because it was a different perspective on, it wasn't just talking about forest pests, right? You were talking about like, hey, these are all parts of the ecology of our land that we also need to consider and think about. And there's a lot more going on. We can't just be thinking about what's in front of us and what's currently being wrecked, because we need to be paying attention to everything else. And that'll help us know what's coming. And it was just kind of it was like insect appreciation for an hour. It was great. I liked it.
Yeah.
And so I like that perspective because it's instead of a doom and gloom thing, it's more of a like, hey, this is where the science is at. This is where we should be going. And so it was great. So I think I want to start with trying to put into perspective why people should care about insects.
Yeah, that's a big question.
Right? That's kind of what we're here to answer today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it really depends on the person. But for myself, I think why we should care about insects is because they're fundamental to every ecosystem. I mean, I think we would basically be knee deep in like animal poop and animal carcasses if we didn't have those insects that function to help decompose. Right. We would have fewer food resources because we wouldn't have pollinators functioning to increase fertility of plants, so they are fundamental to every single ecosystem that you can find.
Yeah. They're the what do you call it? The building blocks? Not the building blocks, but they're the bottom of the pyramid. Like you need that. Yeah. So and I think people kind of understand that, but it's interesting that we don't really pay attention to that fundamental part.
That's right. Yeah. Well, I mean, and honestly, it's the mere fact that I think in many cases, how many insects are just tiny, and you don't know what it is. It's a very alien to us, like, body plan. Mm-hmm. So it kind of evokes like horror and disgust in some ways, right? Like even I'm not a big fan of cockroaches.
For sure. Yeah.
So I think there's a whole bunch of different things that are tied up into that. And then I think it's just easier for us as humans to gravitate towards those large things. And especially when it comes to large problems, those are tangible. Those are easy to grab onto.
Yeah.
And when we start to think about how ecosystems interact with everything in there, it's also very intricate. And that is difficult for us as humans. We like to have things as black and white. Gray is difficult for us. And when you start to think about insects and their like just incredible breadth of like life histories and the things that they can do in the environment and how quickly they can evolve, that's a lot for us, I think, to take in. And so it makes it difficult, but we can also flip that and then be curious humans and be like, that is amazing. I want to know more about this one thing.
Totally.
Which is kind of the path that I've gone down. And then it's been opened up, a bigger world to me.
Yeah. I like that a lot because you're right. It can be, I think any topic can be overwhelming when you like first think about the scope of an issue or whatever it might be, right? But if we can just go at it from a place of appreciation, be like, hey, let's just appreciate that there's something going on here that's important. And let's maybe pay attention to that importance. Yep. We don't have to, totally. That makes sense. Yeah. So I think before we get really into, insects as a whole and forest pests and all that kind of stuff, I wanted to talk briefly about pollinators, about bees. What's going on with bees? Because everybody's talking about, you know what I mean? There's the whole, I feel like we got to get this out of the way before we move on.
Yeah.
Because I feel like when people think insects and the importance of insects, they think bees and they think pollinators and they think, oh no, the bees are dying and what? So I think I would like to briefly just touch on that. What's going on with bees kind of globally, but also very specifically in Alberta.
Yeah, certainly.
Or pollinators in general, I should say.
Well, pollinators in general. So there are a bunch of different insect species that pollinate. So flies are pollinators. You have moths that are pollinators.
Oh, okay.
Beetles can be pollinators. So there's a bunch of different species that do pollinate. But bees in particular, it's really interesting. So we have native bees and then we have domesticated European honeybees.
Right.
Those are different. So we have the native bees. So those would be a lot of the bumblebees that you see flying around, big, fuzzy, cute little insects. But then we also have solitary bees and ground nesting bees, and they're not all fluffy like bumblebees.
Yeah.
Some are shiny. They look like flying ants. They might be colorful. They might be dull gray. And so we have a wide variety of bumblebee species, native bee species worldwide, but also in Alberta.
Yeah.
And so then we have just this one species of domesticated honeybee, and that's the only species that produces and makes honey, which is really, when you think about that, honeybees, you should be thinking about them in terms of like cows or chickens, because they're basically livestock.
Right. Yeah.
They can't exist without humans.
Okay.
Taking care of them, helping them to overwinter, you know, all of those things.
At this latitude.
At this latitude. Yeah, okay. Absolutely. And so we have this sort of lumping together of native bees and honeybees.
Okay.
And so people are saying save the bees. As a domesticated crop or as a domesticated wildlife species, there have been issues with honeybees.
Okay.
And they are facing issues with diseases, and you can have these catastrophic colony collapses, especially during cold winters and heavy varroa mite loads. There's also a number of diseases that affect them.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah. So, but really overall, honeybee numbers are increasing because we have that many more people keeping colonies and maintaining colonies.
Yeah.
And
Everyone wants their own honey. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other thing too, honeybees are really associated with like wholesomeness and goodness because of honey and those kinds of like things, right? So it's interesting.
Milk and honey. Yeah.
That's right. So then you have native bees, and those aren't producing honey. They're they're there as pollinators and they're propagating. And a lot of them live in solitary way.
Right.
Okay, so you have a big colony of like hundreds of honeybees, and you have a colony of, a small colony of a bumblebee, and maybe some ground nesters and some solitary bees. We'll use this as an example in the city. So honeybees, they are able to, because of the sheer number of them, they can outcompete our bumblebees and native bee species for pollinator resources. So to counteract that, if you have honeybees, then you should plant a lot of flowers so that you're providing them with food. Honeybees are basically the only domesticated livestock species that we don't provide food for. Would you put cows out and not provide them with appropriate pasture?
Wow. So you're displacing, by having honeybees and not having something for them to be feeding on, you're actually displacing other animals, other insects from their native source. Food.
That's correct. Yeah. And they're highly competitive. And then we also have the diseases that honeybees are afflicted with. Just because you're raising something in a very concentrated manner, you have those diseases that propagate. Those can also be transferred to our native bee populations as well. So
great. That's always good.
Yeah. And so nobody's really going around. You don't want to be treating your native bees with antibiotics to deal with like these various like diseases that they carry as well too. So so
I mean, that's how we got into the chronic wasting disease mess. So let's not do that with insects.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so there is a lot of, so there's kind of this lack of knowledge then around the difference between native bees and honeybees. And it's propagated throughout media as well too. So we have the Cheerios campaign, which is like save the bees, and it was a honeybee.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So save the wild domesticated cow kind of situation, right?
Yeah.
I came across a picture. I was looking through the internet, and it was the United Nations, and they were celebrating World Bee Day.
Okay.
And it was a picture of a honeybee.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And so this is akin to
the United Nations is not known for their specificity.
No, I don't think so. Not in this case. But, in that situation, it's like taking a picture of a chicken and using that to advertise Songbird Day.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah. So,
bit of a misunderstanding.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And so we do have just that issue that's perpetuated in media.
Okay.
And then a lot of corporations are also kind of jumping onto this bandwagon of save the bees. We're hosting a colony of bees on our rooftop. Look at us and how great we are environmentally.
We're pollinating.
Yeah, that's right. So it's something we call bee washing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the situation with native bees, the native pollinators, is that's still a problem? That is dire? Like that is like they are having a problem, or what?
So again, it all depends on the species that you're sort of talking about. But we are seeing declines in insects just generally. Okay. And so you can also assume that that's happening in bee populations. And so there's not a lot of work that's doing like landscape wide monitoring for insects just generally.
Oh, I see.
But some is occurring for native bees. And so one group that, disclaimer, I work with the Alberta Native Bee Council. So we're going into our second province-wide monitoring project this summer. And we have a number of really excellent collaborators. So we're not just doing it on our own, but we have government and governmental arm's length agencies helping us too. So anyways.
That's cool.
Yeah. So this will give us an opportunity to understand kind of generalized trends. We did the first monitoring in 2018. We're doing it again. And we plan to do this every 5 years going forward. Okay.
Yeah. Nice. That's really good.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, in that monitoring, we were able to add, I think, at least one new record of species, or maybe it was 3 actually, new species in Alberta. We were able to record 3 that we know are endangered. And so I think we're just kind of trying to get a handle now on declines generally. I know there's probably other smaller research projects that are looking at this in Europe. And I know in the Western United States, there's a big push for native bee conservation as well too.
Okay. And so the endangered, if you were to like pontificate a little bit on why bee populations would be like struggling? Is it just basically urban sprawl and the lack of connectivity between areas and just kind of people being in the way? Or
yeah, I think that you've got it right there, that landscape conversion is a big push. Yep. Because if all of a sudden, you had meadows and grasslands and that's now been converted into, say, like a monoculture of a canola crop.
Sure.
Well, that has flowers. Canola has flowers, but they only have them for a period of time. So that's not really going to support season-long bee species that need to forage.
This is a topic that, it's funny, the episode that's will have come out right before this one is about kind of like rewilding your local kind of yard and area, right?
Yeah, interesting.
And it got me on this kick of being so frustrated with our urban planning that we're like here in Edmonton we have all of these Scots pine planted that are from the UK. We have all these like eastern and western cottonwoods that are not native here. We have elms, we have ashes, we have Colorado blue spruce for some reason,
the Manitoba
maples, and like we have this stuff that like we have direct replacements for. Like we could have planted white spruce, we could have planted jack pine, we could have planted aspen, we could have planted poplar, we could have planted all of these things that are part of the ecology would have supported this stuff. But instead we're like, nah, let's bring it over from the other part of the world and plant it here because it looks a little bit nicer.
Yep.
And you're just like, damn it, like what a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's difficult. You can do small things to, do like convert your yard and into maybe like a more pollinator friendly habitat.
Yeah.
But it's difficult to do that on the landscape as a whole, especially when it's driving industries, and we obviously need the commerce associated with that. But we have to understand then what we're giving up then in return. Mm-hmm. And I think having a clear eye with that, like I am comfortable with us making certain decisions, but I just want it to always be known what the potential losses are. And let's talk about that in a real way.
Mm-hmm.
And especially when it comes to insect species, there could, for as many insect species as are known, we think that there could be double, triple, quadruple that are unknown and not described.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
You're just like, we don't even know what's out there.
Yeah, so we don't even know exactly what we're losing. And so therefore, again, I think that's my other pitch for like bringing awareness back to insects. And so for sure, they're not as easy to spot. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that. They're not as easy to monitor as, say, like deer populations or putting a collar on a grizzly bear.
Yeah.
But it's just as essential, and if not more, to be monitoring those insects.
That makes sense. It's the building block of the ecology of the landscape, right? Like it's the very bottom of that food web or whatever you want to call it. So it's that makes sense. And I guess you can't do like a helicopter survey for how many mosquitoes. I mean, I'm sure that's not something we're doing, but
no, exactly. Yeah.
But
yeah, exactly. And I guess the one way that we do monitor insects on a landscape level, like through my work as a Government of Alberta employee in the Forest Health Group, is our field staff are out doing aerial surveys. And so but that's landscape scale, very coarse. We're looking at basically tree defoliation.
Oh, okay.
And, and its the way a tree is defoliated or killed is characteristic of the insect that is probably causing that damage. Gotcha. And that's when we were recording it. And that's really interesting information, but that isn't insect biodiversity.
Right.
We're looking at forest pests specifically, and with an eye towards keeping an eye on the trends so that we understand is something potentially outbreaking and could, cause damage to forest resources.
Sure. Can we foresee what may be happening soon?
Yes.
Yeah, totally. Okay, gotcha. So I guess we can dive into the bigger picture a little bit, I guess, of the like how many, like to try and paint the picture of how many insects we're talking about. Because you said we know about X number, there might be 4 times as many. We don't know.
Yep.
So how many do we know about?
Yeah. So I think worldwide, then the estimates vary. So we have species that have been described, right? And so the estimate I've been using lately is about 2.16 million species.
Okay.
That includes everything, have been described.
Okay.
Yeah. And then when we talk about insects, within that same estimate, it's about 50% of those species are insects. So that'd be a little over 1 million species of insects.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you said 2.1, sorry?
2.15
million species total period on the planet.
That have been described.
Not just insects. And then half of that basically is insects.
That's right.
Okay.
And then to bring it down to just an even finer level, we have mammals. And we have about 6,500 species of mammals.
Very small chunk of that pie.
So that is 0.3%
of
the species on Earth are mammals.
And that's probably where most of the focus is.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that's us, that's right.
Yeah,
exactly.
Okay. And then I imagine the other big chunk of that pie is just plants and stuff, mosses and whatever. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. I think fungi are the most, most diverse. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
Species. Yeah.
Yeah. We also, same thing. We don't know a lot about them either.
That's right.
Yeah. It's funny. The things that we have a lot of, we know nothing about. Great. This seems like a good place to start. How can we manage our forest? Well, we should learn about it first, maybe. Right. Yeah. That's tough. Yeah. Wow. So, why do you think, I think I know a bit of the answer, but why do you think there's so much focus on those things, right? Like the plants and the animals, and so little focus on the research of insects?
Yep. Well, when I think specifically about wildlife, right? A lot of our conservation has gone towards wildlife because, well, they're big, they're charismatic. It's a tangible problem you can probably, attach to.
Yeah. You can put a collar on it.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. But also think about it. We have, we've really, there's been always a big push towards wildlife conservation. And so a lot of those folks want to hunt those species. So they're species that we utilize, as well as like, when you think about fish, there's a lot of conservation around, fish and waterways and those kinds of things. So I think especially when you look at it from the government point of view, governments, we're resource limited. There's only certain things we can do. And so you're going to grab those big, tangible issues. Yeah. And so therefore it's just easier in that way to deal with that.
Yeah. It sounds like we need to do some work on making insects tangible.
Yeah. Well, what do I call, I call things like caribou and bears, grizzly bears, charismatic megafauna. And so we need to turn insects into charismatic microfauna. Yeah,
absolutely. But I feel like there has to be a straightforward way of making it, because I like you said, I get it, right? Like hunting, fishing, there's industries around that. There's a lot of interest. There's a lot of focus. People tie their entire lives to those concepts. And so it makes sense that we focus on those issues. That's what the taxpayers want. That's what the taxpayers get. But I feel like there could be opportunity for like a promotional campaign of some sort to just be to point out, look at how cool insects are and what they can do for us and blah, blah, blah. Just try and create some kind of momentum. I don't know, but I feel like this is something you've definitely thought about before.
Yeah, absolutely. And and I think that we have a number of societies, and we, have groups that are hosting bio blitzes and, throughout the summer, and we have different groups who kind of are educating and promoting, but again, you still have to have a receptive audience. And so if you're attending a bio blitz, somewhere in southern Alberta in the middle of the summer, it's because you're already keyed into that. You're
into it. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think, we have so many other issues. There's just so...
You don't say.
There's so many other issues. But again, I think if we delve down into it, well, if we're worried about songbird declines, well, you should really be concerned about insect declines, because what are many songbirds feeding on?
Of course.
They're feeding on insects.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And the birder population's fairly large. I imagine you can probably be able to scoop some of them.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Actually, birds are, given the number of species of birds, the number of research papers that have been done on them is actually way over the limit. There's
oh, really?
Yeah. Birds are very, very well studied, which is excellent. I love that. But then it's okay, we take it down. Yeah. For as well as birds are studied, insects are understudied.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. So, okay. So if insects are so understudied, and someone brought up an interesting question during your talk that I thought was a great point. Speaking of birds and is citizen science an option for insects? Is there a way? My immediate thought, talking about birds, goes to the Merlin Bird ID app. I think everybody knows about that app. Everybody uses it. I can record the sound of a bird, and it's oh, that's a blue jay. I'm That's amazing. Or like, this is some obscure other sparrow, right? And it gets it right, and it's incredible. Or you can, you know what I mean? You can key down through what you've seen, and it's amazing. Like, I feel like the Merlin Bird ID app, if you could like you're saying, the birders should be into this. If you could contact them, tie into them with that app, and like, could we do this for insects? Like, is there a way that we can? Because that feels like a huge potential, right? Like, there's, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. So I think the one difficulty with insects is identification. So you can have.
That's why we need the app.
Yeah. Well, and it's identification using like these little tiny features sometimes. So you have 3 beetles. They're all black. They're all about the same size. They look like they have a similar body plan, but they're cryptic species. And so therefore it's based on like the size of their, their claws, their tarsi. Those are their like little feet.
I saw you trying to move past the scientific term and try and find like their hand foot thing, the end of their appendage. I was like, okay, I like this. This is good.
But so you can kind of like get down to. So I think citizen science could be really valuable in like taking pictures and posting them. Then you need probably like an expert to help you kind of get down to the species level. So I think citizen science has an excellent place, but just given the difficulties with insect identification, and then, taxonomy, and that's that skill of identifying insects, is, so I have a number of friends, some of my best friends are taxonomists. But it's, I wouldn't say that it's a really super attractive a career path necessarily for a lot of people. It takes a lot of patience, a lot of learning.
Really nerdy about it. You gotta really be into it.
That's right. Yeah. So when you want to get it down to that species level. So so I think, citizen science could be really helpful in a lot of different ways. So it could be, say, like assisting by setting out these kind of generalized traps maybe in your yard. Maybe here's something. We could like set out a transect that runs from the south to the north in the province. And we have the same kind of trap that's being set out for, 1 week period. And we could have all these citizen scientists setting those traps up and collecting the trap catch. And then we collect it, and then it goes to a repository and somebody needs to identify it, you could have some aspects like that. So I think citizen science can play into it, but it's just a little bit more difficult because of course insects aren't quite as vocal as birds. But they are making noises and they are communicating in lots of different ways.
It just seems like we're in the age of citizen science now, right? Like we're like even with I was looking for a plant app to do like those plant snap and all those ones. You don't even need that anymore. You just take a picture of it on Google and it tells you what it is. And you're like, oh, perfect. You can do, sometimes you have to do a little bit of digging, but you don't even need those anymore. So like, I feel like maybe I've never tried it for an insect. I should try it on a woodlice and just see what
it brings up.
See if how close it gets, right? Like who knows?
Yeah, exactly. And so I think for conservation, we do need to know species to a certain degree, but I think for general understandings of, is it a beetle versus a butterfly? And then you can kind of get down a little bit deeper. And maybe you can't get to species all the time. Maybe in some cases you can.
There was a really cool, speaking of this, every once in a while I do go down that route and I'll find an insect and my daughter will be like, what is this? I'm like, I have no idea. Like, there's a website and I'll have to put it in the show notes. I'll find it later. I forget what it was called, but it's an Alberta. I think it was an Alberta based website.
Bugs of Alberta.
Yeah. Is that the one? And it has all the families. It's like, it has like 10 or 12 different options and you click and you can kind of, that one's pretty cool. I've definitely used that to like figure out what I'm looking at and it's worked.
Yeah, absolutely. There are some ways that you can like for some of the more like common species.
It's definitely, more common species for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when you think about it too, like moths and butterflies for sure are a little bit easier to identify because they've got all those more visible, like, you know,
that one's blue.
Colors
that one's
of their
yellow.
scales. Exactly. They've got little balls on the top of their, antenna, like those kinds of things. It's a little bit easier. So it's easier with some species and then some not. So I think it's important that we understand a lot of the more common species. But also it's really important that we understand those really rare ones. And that's where we need that taxonomic expertise to be maintained. So there is a way that you can use DNA And it's like, I don't know a lot about the technique, but it's like basically looking at the environment. So you can use environmental DNA. So as we go on, we are barcoding and understanding the genetic makeup of a lot of different species, right? I don't even know. It's an excellent technique. So you could potentially start to identify, things in that manner using this environmental DNA. So you get a sample, something, it's all mushed up together, and then they're able to look at the components and
so like just a chunk of dirt you grab them from the bush, or what are we talking about here?
Yeah, I think that you can do it like in that kind of way.
Okay.
Yeah. So with insects, like I'm thinking about, say, if you had this like trap catch of a very generalized from a generalized trap that collects everything.
Oh yeah.
Then maybe instead of having to like sort through it all, maybe you could do it that way as well too.
Oh, I see. Directly from the ins, because okay, I see what you're saying. Okay, I was trying to get up because you said environmental. I was like, are they just like grabbing soil and like there's like stuff left behind that they're IDing? But you're saying you can actually directly do it with a catch too, like with the actual insects themselves. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I think you could do it in that way too. I think eDNA is being used in other ways more so. Like but I that's potentially something I think I've heard of a couple studies using it in that way. Maybe in Europe they're actually using it to monitor insect species.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah,
that's very cool. Technology is awesome.
Yes.
So much going on. It's hard to keep up with.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but I think we need a balance of those people who can do those kinds of like genetic analyses. You know, maybe there's a future where you don't have even an app. It's a little barcoder and you can just walk up to an insect and scan it with your barcode and then But then I think you still need that skill set of having people who can describe species and understand them. It's a language in and of itself, which I think is very beautiful and rich. Yeah. But it's, again, that's not accessible for everyone.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, can we paint a picture of the biodiversity? Like if you were to try to explain what's going on biodiversity wise in, let's say, Alberta right now, as far as like those species that are like having a hard time or endangered or are maybe as a result of something, or actually there's too many of them or whatever. Can we kind of paint that picture of where we're at so people understand what's going on with insects in a general? Yeah.
Yeah. So I can't really speak to like the specifics because again, like my everyday life is forest pests. And so I kind of, I really focus in on that. But I think generally we know that there are declines happening in terrestrial insects for sure. There's a lot of research, but a lot of that research is based in Europe. So we more so know from these trends there. Yep.
Yeah. That makes sense.
But and so again, so the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute has a beautiful like network of plots they are monitoring.
Yeah.
Across
Very
the
cool.
province. It's amazing. So the only arthropods, so insects are arthropods, as are spiders. Spiders are arthropods. But they are studying something called a soil or a batted mite. And that's the only arthropod that they're studying. Okay. So, and we're just kind of getting that baseline data now.
So they're only studying the one?
Yes.
Insect.
Arthropod.
Arthropod, because insects are, those are arthropods, and then insect is another branch off of that. Spiders are one. And
that's right.
Mites are another one?
Spiders, so arachnidia. So you have, arthropods, and then under that you have insecta. Yeah. And then you have arachnidia, and then you have the crustaceans. Oh, right. Yeah. And then you have things like the, centipedes and
other weird ones that are all okay.
Yeah, exactly.
It's so funny. Like they're all like so insects is a very specific part of we'll call it the bug world for this purpose. But so there's a bunch of other I didn't realize that insects, I should have known this. I did entomology, like a few different courses in university. Sorry, John Spence, I apologize. So I'm trying. I knew spiders weren't technically insects or whatever, but I forgot that there was a whole nother thing.
Yeah. So insects always have 6 legs, and they have the 3 segmented body plans.
Oh, right.
The head, the thorax.
It's all coming back to me now.
There you go. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then that totally makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. So they're studying this soil or a batted mite. And I like in and of itself, it is important because if you have good, healthy soil, and these mites would be an indicator of that. So that makes sense. So if you have good, healthy soil, then you can maybe hopefully assume that a lot of the above ground processes are in play.
Right.
So I think that's the logic behind it. I think that there was some pushback early on in the monitoring days of ABMI, and that maybe other indicators could have been used, such as like carabid. These are these big ground beetles that are predators and detrivores, and they could have been also a really useful group to monitor.
Sure. You got to do something though.
Yep.
Like, doing something is better than doing nothing. So
that's right.
That's great. Okay, cool.
Yep.
So
So generally with insect populations, again, I wouldn't say that we are seeing like across the board declines, because we're having occasional, outbreaks of certain species. They're just so dependent on weather and habitat conditions.
Yeah.
So I think that it can be hard to make some assumptions. So we have, there was the heat dome that happened right in 2022.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like so sure that was going to be followed by a year of like insect outbreaks because of how stressed the trees would have been.
Right.
Well, but I didn't think about it. Insects also have like an upper limit for temperature as well too. So we actually saw there was this population of aspen defoliators that had been on the increase for the previous like 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
They collapsed.
Forest tent caterpillar?
No, it wasn't forest tent caterpillar. It was some other little species that like are leaf rollers and and leaf tires. And they collapsed. They disappeared the next year. We didn't see them in our aerial surveys.
Yeah.
And that's because as they're feeding is like those little soft, gushy larvae at that time when we had that heat dome, just
dries them out, turn them into little chips.
Exactly. Right. So it can be unpredictable, some of these things, but I know better now what my assumptions would be going into the future. So that's why monitoring is so key and crucial.
Yeah, totally. So, we're talking a lot about monitoring.
Yep.
How do we do that? Obviously, you said like ABMI is one way. So they have those plots that are evenly distributed across the landscape, and they do a whole deep dive every I can't remember how many, every 7 years or something like that. Yeah. And they go in there, and I'm sure they do soil pits and whatever they do, right? They do everything.
Yeah.
And it's very intensive. So what other ways are there of monitoring insect biodiversity or whatever it might be, insect pests or whatever it might be? What do we do? How do we do to measure it? How do we map it?
Yeah, so usually what you'd want to be doing is, so say in the case of ground beetles, you would be placing out pitfall traps, and maybe you'd do that along a transect. So that's a way you can monitor insects. We have traps, so something called like a malaise trap, that as insects are like flying, they just get they're intercepted by the trap and they fall into, the cup, and then you can collect them that way. We have species specific traps. And so for a lot of defoliators, we would be monitoring. So the females communicate by sending out a sex pheromone, and that helps make sure that she is attracting a same species male to her. Sure. So if you want to, monitor black army cutworm, which is potentially an issue in the province, you could set out traps baited with the female sex pheromone, and then you would be able to count the number of moths that are coming to those traps. And then those are direct observations of the insects themselves. And then the other way that you could monitor is using aerial overview surveys. So
the defoliation.
Yeah, that's right. Of defoliation.
I was like, wait, how can you see the insects?
Yeah, that's right. So this is an exactly indirect method.
Okay.
Yeah,
indirect,
you'd be indirectly. Yeah. So we're basically looking to see how much area has been defoliated by a given insect.
Okay.
And you can kind of track that from year to year. And you'd look at tree mortality the same way.
Sure.
Then I know that some provinces have started to move into using remote sensing as well too, specifically for spruce budworm.
Are they using like multispectral stuff, or what are they using for
I think that they're actually just like using like Landsat, and then they're looking like at before after.
Oh, okay. Just like, are these trees alive or are they dead?
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like, okay. Gotcha. That's interesting. I always think about the multispectral imagery, which is, I guess I should explain it. It's not all that common, but it's basically just like flying over aerially, and you can detect. I think it's the amount of chlorophyll.
Yeah.
It's chloroform. I was just listening to an audiobook, a sci-fi audiobook. They were talking about chloroform. It's in my head. It incepted me. But chlorophyll, the amount of chlorophyll that's active in the plant or something like that, and it tells you whether or not it's stressed. I think it's used a lot in agriculture and that. And it'd be cool to see how applicable or if it's useful in this setting, right? But
Yeah.
anyways, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's cool. Okay. So there's lots of different options on how to do this monitoring.
Yep.
And-
You can observe, you can, walk transects and observe insects. You can go out and observe the damage.
Right.
So you can also trap them. So
Okay.
then you're directly collecting the insects, or you can,
Gotcha.
Indirect.
So we just need more money to do more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and so our forest health group, like I said, we're monitoring damage from the air. We'll also, get on the ground and monitor for specific insects if there's
Sure.
an issue that emerges. But we are only focused on forest pests.
Right.
And so really we need another, group that could be better, say ABMI received more funding.
Yeah.
And they were able to expand their insect monitoring.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So if you got a big pot of money, I don't know how much you'd want, but like if you're the you're the czar of forest pests in Canada or Alberta or whatever, where would you put that money? What would you do to try and get the most bang for your buck?
Yeah, well, again, I would leverage what's already there because ABMI has, a really excellent network, and their protocols are robust, and so they really know what they're doing when it comes to that. So,
so more intensive stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Cool. Okay. So I guess we can we can jump into the forest pest conversation. I think now. I think we've done our homework. We've kind of laid the groundwork for what's going on. Okay. So forest pests, first of all, that word, I get the gist listening to your talk that the word forest pest is kind of not your favorite word.
Yeah, no, it's not. No, it's not, because really insects are only pests as defined by us.
Sure.
They're just out there doing their thing.
Right.
Living their lives, and their populations fluctuate. And it's when it's something that becomes intolerable, aesthetically unpleasing to us, or, is potentially going to damage forest resources on a large scale, then that's a pest to us.
Yeah.
It's kind of different in forestry because in agriculture, it's easy to define these. So we have a process that's called integrated pest management.
Okay.
And it involves a number of different processes. You try to be preventative, but also, if you have an insect population, you monitor it, you figure out what the level of population is, you can directly connect that to damage. That's your economic damage threshold. And then, if it's going to exceed that, then we need to treat the pest with some kind of pesticide. You want to manage it in some way. Below that, it's acceptable, and you can live with it.
Gotcha.
It's more difficult in the forestry sense to link those two things.
Yeah.
So, so pests, that's our human definition.
Yeah, we're calling them that because they're pissing us off. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And so, insects, they naturally fluctuate with weather conditions, with the presence, absence of natural enemies that may be or may not control their populations. It could be the amount of host material that they would be feeding on that's present.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yep. And really, our boreal forest is driven by disturbance. The integrity of that ecosystem requires disturbance in order to continuous forest succession and renewal, and insects are integral to that process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so when you remove a disturbance, that ecosystem becomes increasingly susceptible to exaggerated disturbances.
I like the way you put that, because I think a lot of people listening right now are going, maybe not right now because this isn't live, but later when this goes out, they're thinking about, fire suppression. They're thinking about the pine beetle outbreak as a result of, fire suppression and homogeneous landscapes and all of these types of things that were just like, it is interesting that we were able to, human beings on a more meta level, we were able to just like come in and start like tweaking things the way we want them.
Yeah.
And just expect it to be fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like, I'm sure this will be fine if we change it.
Yeah.
It'll be okay. I'm sure there won't be consequences in 100 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and then we alter, the successional path of a forest. And then we also alter the climate in a long-term way. And then you end up with an outbreak like mountain pine beetle. So, Mountain pine beetle has always been present in Alberta, but it had been restricted to the southern reaches of the province. And there had been minor outbreaks before in Banff, Kananaskis areas, I think like in the 40s and maybe one before that. But, so mountain pine beetle has always been there.
Yeah.
It's a part of the ecosystem. But it wasn't until our winters started to become warm enough, then you could have a population of mountain pine beetle that then could, number one, plop over from BC into our forests and then expand its range and establish itself. So it is here now.
Yeah.
The outbreak has, subsided. There's been a lot of work, obviously, protecting the resource through the single tree control programs, as well as forest industry. Has participated in that. But really what knocked, I think, the main driver, and hopefully I'm not going to get fired. Anyways, no, the main drive, like one of the big drivers in the decline, was weather. Yeah. And so we had 2 really cold winters where we had high levels of overwinter mortality. Yeah. And then we had a really smoky summer and followed by a wet summer. And that seemed to cause some reproductive failure in those situations.
Gotcha.
And so we had weather on our side.
Right. We got lucky.
Yep. And
after about a decade or 15, 20 years of
2006,
whatever it was. Yeah.
Yeah. So almost 20 years.
Yeah.
So now mountain pine beetle is here. It's a part of our forests.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because we've been out doing ground surveys this last spring. Yeah. And you can hardly find a mountain pine beetle.
Yeah.
People who are researching mountain pine beetle are desperate for us to find mass attack trees, right?
Right.
So now mountain pine beetle subsided. It's just kind of in the forest. It's still present. We know that it's being trapped by other people doing sort of like low density population research.
Right.
And so I think in this way, when we look to the United States, which has a longer history with mountain pine beetle outbreaks there, and I think it was in the Sierra Nevada region.
Okay.
So what they actually determined is that after mountain pine beetle had gone through and act as sort of like a disturbance agent where it just thinned the forest, those leftover remaining trees were more resilient to drought going into the future.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. So
more resistant to drought. Can you explain that to me? I don't get it.
It was just fewer competitors for water, right? So mountain pine beetle went in and took.
I see. There's more water available now.
That's right.
So it's not like the trees adapted. It's just that there's less trees, so now there's more. I see.
That's right. Okay. And so it kind of thinned the forest in that way.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Yeah. So that was going to be my question. I was like, what is the role of forest pests, as we call them, right? And that is the role. It's like it's part of the ecology. It's part of the life and death cycle of thinning things out and making sure it's not like, I mean, this homogeneous carpet of the same age of trees from.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And, even so insects that defoliate aspen. So if you have a year where you have like a forest ant caterpillar outbreak, maybe localized, then they're eating those leaves. They're opening up the canopy. Yeah. And so more sunlight is like reaching down to those shade intolerant species and perhaps, allowing a certain amount of release of growth.
Right.
So you could have that. And then also those leaves are falling. The insects are eating. And what do we do when we eat? We all poop. And so there's like a little bit of a pulse of like nutrients, into the system. Yeah. And so it kind of like acts in that way. But then those forest ant caterpillars, they are also food. Yeah. Bears, I've seen actually pictures of bears eating handfuls of like forest ant caterpillar.
Oh, why not?
Yeah, exactly. That provides a source of food for, birds, right? Yeah. And so again, I don't know if there's been research that links like short-term pulses in the increase in bird reproduction. I have no idea,
I guess,
Could it? Maybe.
How many cubs are out next year because of the, I think about those wild, I can't remember when I first started working in forestry, it would have been like 2008 or something like that. As a summer student, I think it was 2008, 2009, one of those years, there was a mass year of forest ant caterpillars, and I was doing layout. So a cut block layout, walking through the bush all day long. And I remember literally swimming through the hanging vines of forest hen caterpillars,
Yeah.
and you're pulling like handfuls
Oh,
out
yeah.
of them out of your hood, and it's just like,
Yeah.
I was like, what is going on, right? And it's, I gotta imagine those years that, there's a certain number of megafauna that we appreciate are having a good time. Like,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Again, uncomfortable and gross for us because we're obviously getting back into our field trucks and like smushing forestry caterpillars all over the seats and all the rest. But you know, it's a part of it, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, and then I think too when we think about fires, right? So we have one of my first field jobs was doing woodpecker nesting success studies.
Okay.
In burned and unburned areas, and so we were working in Jasper in a prescribed burn area, and yeah, the woodpeckers were going after all those like monocamus species that are big beetles that, you know, get into those trees after they've been burnt and
Right.
maybe not 100% killed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just like it's more opportunity for broader biodiversity in general.
Yeah.
Just like and I mean, that's the thing. Like I talk a lot, obviously, on this podcast about like fire and stuff because it's just such a big topic right now, and it goes on a lot. And we talk about the need for more heterogeneous forests, and one thing I go back to is are you aware of the Mountain Legacy Project?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I did an episode with him long time ago, years ago now. And he's looking at these images from like the early 1900s and pictures of mostly the mountains, but and it shows a huge difference in like the amount of biodiversity of landscape that we had, right? Like there was a lot more just like pocket forests and grasslands and meadows and different ages of stuff. And then the same picture from today, it's just this carpet of pine going across the hills. And you're like, okay, so we need to go, technically speaking, we need to go back to that kind of a forest structure. And that these insects, these pests as we call them, are like a huge part of that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They really help drive that.
Yeah. We need that stuff. We talk about fire all the time, but like this and windfall and all the other types of disturbances are all important. Yeah,
absolutely. And then fire and insects, do interact as well too. So this year, some of our industry folks were noticing that blocks that had burned last year, they were in the process of, rehabilitating those blocks and planting seedlings, conifer seedlings. But of course, we have this like lovely insect that's called black army cutworm that the females are attracted to the bare soil. So the female moths. And so they fly in, they're attracted to the bare soil after the fire. So they were there, these females, last year, laying their eggs in the soil. And then those little larvae, they hatched from those eggs and started feeding on a little bit of material. They overwinter and then they, reemerge as larvae this last spring. And so our partners are seeing that, there is a lot of defoliation of these seedlings.
Yeah.
And so, there's that association. It's going to be a short pulse of this insect being increased because the suitable habitat for oviposition just kind of disappears after a while. And so,
those things are going to happen.
Things are going to happen.
We're trying to manage, like we as the benevolent human beings, we're trying to manage this forest.
Yeah.
And we know that things are going to go not to plan. So like we need to be prepared. We can't be surprised when we can be upset and we can do something about it. But we can't be surprised by the fact that there's pests out there that are, pissing us off.
Yeah, that's right. And, I honestly kind of find it exciting because it's another opportunity to talk with industry and, and come together and like jointly monitor, a forest quote unquote pest and learn and understand a little bit more.
Sure.
Because mountain pine beetle and forest hen caterpillar has been our like sole focus. In some ways, I was just getting so tired of talking about mountain pine beetle, but at the same rate, it's kind of like our poster insect, because I think that people started to like be more curious about insects a little bit generally. Because of forest mountain pine beetle, right? And so they were curious about it. We're getting phone calls about people asking questions, and so always taken, it's probably annoying, but taken an opportunity to try and like just always talk a little bit more beyond mountain pine beetle and insects and just so I use it as a gateway insect.
The gateway insect, I would say it's the polar bear of the insect,
that's
in the forest pest world, right? Like it just brings everybody's attention. Like, so what's going on? Why are they important? Why do we need them? Why should we appreciate? That's interesting. No, I like that a lot. And like it's I think this idea of trying to reframe, as you put in your talk, trying to reframe our idea of forest pest and our relationship with them. I think that feels like a big deal, right? Like going from being like, these damn pests to being like, okay, how do we manage this or manage around this or make sure that, like it's just, this is going to happen. It's an inevitability. It's just a matter of like, okay, what do we do?
Exactly. What do we do or what do we not do? And for many of the forest insects that our group is recording, we're not really doing anything about it because they're just a part of the system. And that's the main thing to understand. It's when you have kind of like that interface with the urban area that it becomes a problem.
Right.
I would also say, so I'm talking about like the broader boreal forest and, aspen parkland. But of course we have urban forest pests. And those I would say are probably more damaging. And it would be these invasive species that we could be encountering, right? So emerald ash borer has been, so it's, a non-native that was introduced. I'm not even sure when it was introduced, but it's kind of slowly made its way across the US. It was a quarantine species. The US decided to stop regulating it. And I think for reasons I'm not entirely sure, but probably because it's just kind of spread everywhere and it's difficult. It's just going to be impossible.
Like it's too much too fast.
Yeah, exactly. So emerald ash borer has popped up into Canada. We had the closest population to Alberta was in Winnipeg, and that showed up in 2017. And invasive species are difficult because they're usually there for many years before you actually detect them.
Right.
Well, unfortunately, what happened is in 2023 in Vancouver, just like just an average person was walking down the street and a green, shiny, beautiful beetle landed on their shoulder. And this person recognized it as emerald ash borer. And that's the first observation of emerald ash borer in the West for us in Western Canada. So, so I think that's probably these urban pests are going to be the ones that are more problematic.
Yeah. Well, like Edmonton has tons. It's like it's mostly elms, but it's moving over to like elms and ash in the boardwalk species. So like there's a huge feeding frenzy for them if they ever hit Edmonton. They'll just like blow through it. Yeah,
that's right. And we've been pretty safe in Edmonton for a long time just because of climate. And
it's cold here.
Exactly. We've had some pretty inhospitable winters, and I'm not sure because you can model what the current susceptibility of the climate would be and how susceptible we are to, say, a pest like emerald ash borer establishing, but we're warming. And so we will be facing that,
Yeah. That's common.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, the idea of climate change and like how that, because I can imagine in your position, someone whose responsibility it is to keep tabs on forest pests or the biodiversity or insects in general. And you've already said, you're like, we don't know a lot about what's going on. There's a lot going on that we're not aware of. And now the climate is changing.
Yeah.
So it just throws another enormous question mark into like, they're like, what do you think is going to happen? You're like, I have no idea.
Yeah.
I don't even know the baseline, let alone like where it's going to go. Right.
Yeah.
I can only imagine the frustration that must throw. Cause I imagine you get those questions all the time. Like what's going on with climate change? What should we do to prepare? Like, yeah,
that's right. And then I think when we think about that, well, because we don't know what the next big forest insect outbreaking insect is going to be, what we need is really a focus on making our landscape like resilient.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
So if you have a resilient landscape, then that is one that can undergo disturbance and then recover ecosystem process functioning.
Yes.
That's what we want.
Love that.
I honestly don't exactly, in my personal opinion, I don't care what the forest looks like. I want the forest to function and support all the insects and wildlife species and birds and plants that should be there.
We call them values. We say support all the values.
Values at risk.
All the values.
That's
what I always talk about here, just like the forest values. Yep. So you just whatever those it doesn't matter if they're human values or whatever, but you want it to be healthy. You want all the values there and to be healthy. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. And we're working towards that. So just like you spoke about before, a more heterogeneous forest in species as well as age is really important, because then usually like mountain pine beetle, they love those 80-year and older lodgepole pine trees when they're in that outbreaking stage. So if you don't have a concentration of that host, then you're going to reduce the scope of the outbreak. Still could have the minor uptick, but that's okay.
You are going to have it. Just a matter of, it won't exactly. So it's a matter of not allowing ourselves to go back to this place of, now that the pine beetle have killed everything.
Yeah, that's right.
We shouldn't allow ourselves to have a continuous, 80 to 120 year old pine forest that goes from BC to Alberta to promote that. So you got to start breaking that up and because it's over 80 years where the bark is thick enough that they can survive or something, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the phloem layer is nice and thick under there, nice and juicy, and supports.
That's actually, that's the insulator. Yes. I guess that's the one full of water, so that makes sense.
Well, the bark insulates, but then it's the phloem layer is thick enough to provide the good resources for the offspring.
Right. Oh, I see. That's the
it's part and parcel. But some interesting research I've done at the U of A just recently has been looking at, what's coming up after mountain pine beetle.
Yeah.
What's regenerating in those forests.
What's the crystal ball look like?
Yeah, that's right. And so it seems like in the drier, more poor sites, you are having lodgepole pine regenerate.
Okay.
Just because there's more sunlight and they're warmer sites and drier. And so just good germination source sites. For lodgepole pine. But what we're finding, what this work has found, is that you have more of a mixed forest coming up in the more rich, wetter sites.
Yep.
And so you have forest regeneration and forest succession kind of like restarting in those places. I think that's good.
Yeah. No, for sure. Yeah. We want it more diverse. We want changing landscapes over the cross of everything, right? And make sure that we maintain many of those values as possible. Yeah.
That's right.
It's interesting when we talk about forest resilience, whether it's with pests or wildfire or climate change or whatever thing we're worried about, it's always the same answer.
I think it does come down to that.
I find that interesting that it always comes down to the same thing. And that's like, hey, we need lots of everything and not an abundance of one thing.
Yeah,
it just comes down to that. And you're like, okay, so how do we do that, right?
And that's right. That's right. And how do we do that without, adversely affecting forest industry, which is a really important industry in Alberta, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to still obviously manage for the economic side of things.
Of course. Yeah.
And so how does that need to change?
Yeah.
And then of course, how does government policy need to change then to also support and enable our forest industry to do some of the things that they need to do and try?
That's a huge point. I think that's a point that always that often comes up in this show too, is that I think forest companies be willing to try different things and do if they're given the leeway to do that and not get their hands slapped. But there's a lot of regulations and policy in the way that prevents them from, regenerating a certain species on a site because the old inventory called it white spruce. We got to put white spruce here, even though it's supposed to be black spruce or whatever it's supposed to be, right? Yeah. And there might need to be, and it's this interesting conversation about giving professionals the leeway to make decisions on the landscape based off of their expertise, but also the regulator making sure that they're not doing the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And it's this weird thing of like you want to give power, but you also don't want to give too much power. And it's this very strange dynamic of we're like, hey, we need more power on the landscape at a local level to make local decisions and not get in trouble for trying to change it up, trying to do something different. And so it's all leading up to that, right?
Yeah, it's difficult because policy is difficult to change. It's a slow boat to turn, right? So, it is difficult. And I think especially when we're faced with questions like assisted migration, And hey, Alberta is like really, when it comes to tree species, it's not very diverse, right?
Yeah, there's not a lot of them. Yeah.
No, that's right. So what are some of the things that maybe new tree species that we want to try? Well, you've got a very narrow corridor of species that we can migrate from Montana into Alberta, right?
Right.
So, and right now our policies are, set, and I think for good reason, that you can't plant exotics, species.
Mm-hmm.
So, but we need to maybe try out some of these new species and give those a try. So
that's the thing. Trees in general, I should put my foot in my mouth maybe, but I don't think they're very invasive. You know what I mean? Like they're pretty slow at the uptake. It's not like an insect or mouse or some small whatever, right? Like where their regeneration time is several times a year.
Yep.
Trees take, I don't know, how long do they take before their first like actual
at least 80
sexual opportunity, right?
Yeah,
like it takes a bit. So like I don't think we need to worry too much about that. And and then I know there's conversations around moving species in elevation right now, right? Like moving like just moving them up in elevation or down in elevation or trying to, but it's interesting because the ecology of the landscape, like the soil resources are kind of what they are. They might get more dry or more wet over time, and you might get a little bit of fluctuation in nutrients based off of like what's going on above ground, but the parent material is not going to change. So there's only certain options that are available there. So there's only certain things you can actually plant there. But that's a whole like seed zone. What do we do with the seeds? What do we do? Where do we put the trees with climate change? Like that's a whole nother.
Yeah.
It
is. Well, but the one thing I think about too is like I think you would potentially change the chemistry of soil because say like if you plant ponderosa pine, I have no idea. Like again, I'm not a tree physiologist.
Yeah.
But like, could you change? But then how much so say it's like, I don't know, more acidic needles or something like that. And it's going to create even more acidic underneath. So then how does that percolate into the soil and how does that change things? But then the other thing, of course, that I think about is like, well, how susceptible is a ponderosa pine in Alberta to mountain pine beetle? Could it actually be more susceptible than lodgepole pine?
Yeah.
So could we then just be replacing a species with one that's even more,
So many questions.
Yeah, exactly. And we have this interesting example. So there was like the Great Green Wall project in China. So they were looking so this is like in the 60s, 70s. They were trying to stop the encroachment of the Gobi Desert from the north.
Oh, I see.
So they planted so they undertook this project to plant like a billion trees to stop the movement. And it makes complete sense. And so they were planting all these poplars, but they had this hybrid poplar that was really fast growing. So it's obviously going to establish fast, going to achieve their goals more quickly. Well, unfortunately, it was really susceptible to Asian longhorn beetle. And Asian longhorn beetle had been previously restricted to, I think, the eastern provinces. Not really a big problem, but love these hybrid poplars. They were susceptible. And so it was attacking them and killing these trees. And then this coincided with an increase in intercontinental transport of goods.
Great. Perfect. So now they're everywhere.
Yeah, because then that material was used as packaging material. And so this is one of the ways that Asian longhorn beetle kind of like became an invasive species. So we have to be careful.
Totally.
I mean, about
when you're playing God with the ecology of the landscape, it's like, hey, you should probably think about this a little more because there's been literally billions of years of evolution leading up to this moment in time.
Yeah.
And you're just going to be like, well, I think it should be like this.
Yeah.
It's like, well, the natural world might have something to say about that. Yeah.
But I think, we need to be looking at some innovative, things and taking some risks in the forest. I think that's important. Do it on a limited scale and then, maybe expand from there. But anyways, that is again, not my exact realm.
Totally. Yeah. No, but it is interesting to point out that I think I'm getting the same kind of answers from everybody about like what the future forests in North America need to kind of look like. And that is different age classes, moving trees around, at least in elevation or seed zones to try and help them acclimatize to wherever they might need to be in 80 years, 100 years, when they're propagating more. Also, more disturbance, more varied disturbance, like more little fires, more prescribed fire, more cultural burns and stuff like that, more like creating opportunities for maybe, I don't know, for insect outbreaks in certain areas. I have no idea. Like, I'm just saying, like, there's been, it's always the same endpoint. It's like, we need more diversity in like structural diversity and everything. No matter what you're talking about. So I feel like we've come to a consensus here where we're like, this is what we need to do. Let's just start doing that. And I'm super interested to see where that goes, because I would have thought that, you know, the forest, so much forest industry in Alberta and BC and whatever else, you would think that would break up the landscape enough, age class wise, but apparently not. Apparently it's still quite homogeneous, and it might have to do with regeneration policies or whatever it might be. But apparently we need to do more than what's being done. So yeah.
And I think there's some really interesting ideas out there, like the triad, you know, sort of approach maybe. But again, I think it's combinations of things happening on the landscape.
Okay. So I think one term that I wanted to bring up with you, and we've talked about it already, but I like thinking about it this way, was the like insect conservation. Just the concept of conserving insects. It's kind of a thought. You're just like, what do you mean by conserve? But insect conservation, would that just be doing this, creating resilient landscapes, creating opportunity for diversity, and like that would be the solution to that? I think maintaining habitat.
And you know, it's and I think the bigger issues are like sort of wholesale land conversion. That is a bit of a problem, because so say you have a harvest a block. Well, that opens up and will change the community of insects that would be present.
Totally.
But that happens over time anyways. So I'm not saying, you know, don't touch anything. But like, I think when we think about it in that way, I think that, you know, we need to, you know, think about whole scale landscape conversion, you know, and then, you know, obviously in our daily lives, pesticide use, those kinds of things.
That makes sense. I had a whole conversation with Ellen McDonald about the concept of us like trying to emulate natural disturbance as like in forest harvest and stuff like that. And clearly that's not, even though that was the intention, that's not what we're doing, right? Because we're removing fiber from the land base, and that's never happened before. So I find that an interesting point of kind of focus. I'm like, okay, well, how do we do this in a diversity of ways to try to create a diversity of options for habitat and biodiversity, right? And that's kind of where we're at, I think, is how do we make this? And then it comes down to, at the end of the day, it comes down to dollars and cents. And you're like, hey, how do you make that profitable for forest companies so that they can continue to manage the forest and keep the economy afloat and like provide the services that we need from them to try to create habitat and try to create these options, right? So it's an interesting, it's a political space at this point almost.
It is. Well, and especially so if you think about endangered species, I don't have a specific example offhand, but especially when it comes to insects, they obviously become so you have a butterfly, you're at maybe the southern edge of its habitat. Well, that landscape is you know, transitioning into a different habitat type. So of course it's going to be more rare there. So I guess the question in that case is, you know, if it is abundant across the remaining part of its habitat, which is more intact or whatever it might be, then maybe you wouldn't be trying to conserve an insect species there. But especially with landscape conversion, then their habitat is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller.
Straight up, just removing it. It's not.
So, but I think when I think about insect conservation, that is definitely like an important aspect of it, but we don't even know if we need to conserve it at this point in time.
You don't know what you don't know.
No.
Yeah. But I think like hedging your bets is always a good idea.
Yes. Absolutely. And so, you know, I really think it's important that we just expand our monitoring and better understand, you know, I can almost guarantee that we will discover new species to Alberta almost every time that you have these large scale monitoring projects. They're discovering new species and new records for Alberta. And that in and of itself is just important because insects have an intrinsic value. regardless of them being pollinators for us or pests for us, they actually have a right to just live and exist.
There's still a piece of the puzzle that is this ecology of the world, and you still need them. You can't remove it because there will be cascading effects that you don't want.
That's right. And everything's already going to be so challenged with, climate change that we may end up having this move towards more generalized species because, say, it's an insect that can use a bunch of different types of resources. So that's great because that's more resilient, but then we lose those important rare species.
Yeah. What's that quote from Aldo Leopold, the cogs and wheels thing, or he said or something about proper forest management is the maintenance of all the parts, make sure you keep all the parts and not eliminating any of them, and something about cogs and wheels. I don't know. Aldo Leopold, he was a good guy. He knew what he was talking about back, he wrote some books a while back and they still apply today. But he said something about that, keeping all the parts, and we need to be thinking about all that. So what would you say? Do you have any actionable stuff for people? So, for example, we can break it down into two categories. Break it down into what can the everyday person do to try to help in some way, whatever that might be. And then secondarily, what can actual, biologists and environmental professionals, forest professionals do?
Yeah. The first thing that I would say is just be curious, because open your eyes, you will see so much.
Yeah.
You will see so much, because I don't have to go all the way to Banff to go view wildlife. Yeah. I can sit in my backyard with my cup of coffee and watch the 6 different types of bees that are currently pollinating my asparagus plant that's in bloom.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah. That's amazing. So I think
pay attention. Pay attention.
Yeah. Just be curious. Yeah. The second thing is, I would say, if you can, don't just swat and kill anything that happens to walk past you, please. It kind of breaks my heart a little bit every time.
Sure.
I am that person who's encouraging my friends not to smack all the mosquitoes that are maybe flying around.
Yeah.
Anyways, but so I think...
you must be very popular camping.
Yeah, that's right. I also am lucky in that mosquitoes don't really like my blood. So.
Right, yeah. That's funny.
But I think as far as it goes for your yards, I think maintaining a diversity, don't just have a lawn, and that's a devoid habitat for most insects, right? You have trees and shrubs and flowers that are blooming all throughout the season. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Leaving some bare patches, of soil, that's going to help the ground nesting bees. Having some mess around.
Do the ground nesting bees, I'm thinking about my backyard, do they in the shade or in the sun?
Sometimes I see some species that are right, on the riverbank, and they're nesting right in there. So I think they want to have some warmth, but
okay, yeah. All right.
But also not not super hot. So
yeah. Don't want to be cooked out of there, but okay.
Yeah. But and I think especially when it comes to bees, it's really great not to clean up your garden. Actually, especially if you have plants that have hollow stems, you could have bee species that they spend the overwinter in that, and then if you clean them up, then you're just throwing them all away.
I live up against Terwilliger Drive, which is just a major road here.
Yeah.
And I started placing all of my brush and grass clippings in a pile between Terwilliger Drive and my house, and it's actually a forested area. It's not natural forest. It's Colorado blue spruce and some Siberian larch and stuff like that. But I've started placing all of my slash and stuff like that all out there for exactly that purpose, for to try and provide whatever habitat that the mice are going to use it, unfortunately, but I would like the other insects and birds to use it too.
Yeah.
So I've started thinking about that as well, because it's people, it's kind of unseemly to have a big brush pile in your backyard, but I managed to put mine on the other side of the fence. It's technically on the city's property. So
there you go. Yeah. Well, absolutely. And then in the fall too, just leave your leaves on your lawn. There's a lot of insects that just find these perfect little niches underneath those leaves that will spend the winter.
Yeah.
And so it's a really great habitat. It also makes me a little sad when I drive by and I'm see all those white bags with, I'm oh, how many insects are in there just suffocating right now?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
But, so I think thinking about that, but, and then as a professional, I think lower down the trophic level. And when you see in, disturbance in the forest, like take a moment and think about that a little bit. We don't really have good research that says that, say, protecting like caribou, that doesn't necessarily have downscale effects at conserving everything underneath them. We don't know that that's true.
The umbrella species thing is a bit of a question mark.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I think, again, in that case, just being curious and thinking about how you can think more broadly and just open your eyes. That is the biggest thing, because it just then you start to ask questions and think more deeply about, I think, the ecosystem that you might be working in or the system that you're working in. I
love that idea. Milo Mihailovich once told me something like that, right? He was talking about multiple values in the landscape and how you talk to a forester, they're like, oh yeah, that's an aspen stand, that's a spruce stand, that's a pine stand, that's a mixed wood stand. But then you talk to like a moose hunter, right? And they're like, oh, that's a bullbush, that's a whatever. Or you talk to a forager, and like, oh, that's where I can find my morels, that's where I can find my blueberries. And he was trying to promote the idea of not identifying the forest with the trees, but with everything that's there, because there's a lot going on. It's not just the trees there. And as foresters, they're forest professionals. That's kind of what we do. But you're right. Like as soon as you start to look down the trophic level a little bit and start to think about everything else that's going on, then the richness of it all of a sudden becomes more prevalent, and all of a sudden you're thinking about all those things while you're making decisions. And it's easy to leave a little bit more residual in a cut block, or there's little things you can do when you're there and you're thinking about it and you're active that aren't going to cost any very much and is going to make a big difference down the line. And it's just like thinking broadly about it as you're going. I love that idea. Yeah, absolutely. I think it really immerses you and changes your point of view to a certain degree. Maybe there isn't anything that you would necessarily change, but I think it's a richer of like professional experience just generally because of that. And I think that so like iNaturalist as a platform, you could definitely like snap pictures of insects and post them there. And there are people who go through and do what they can to like help identify as well. And that's good. I didn't know that. So that's good. There's some citizen science opportunities for iNaturalist. That's cool. Good. Yeah. Sweet. Yeah, exactly. I like that. So awesome. Well, any final thoughts? Anything you didn't get to that you wanted to throw out there before we wrap it up? No, I don't think so. I really am glad that we touched on the like insect pest disturbance aspect of things, and the final question was good. Good. So, awesome. Okay. Great. That's it then. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much for listening. That was awesome. Just a love fest on insects, right? And a little bit of conversation around the management, conservation. It was great. I'm really appreciative of Caroline's perspective and nuance in this situation, because it's so easy to be like pine beetle bad, it's so simple. So thank you, Caroline, for taking the time to do this. It was incredible. Again, please, if this is not your first time through, or I guess even if it is your first time through, give this show a rating and a review. Makes all the difference. Share it on social media. It really does help. Thank you very much. Can't wait to share the next one with you. Catch you next time. Take it easy.